Hello everybody, so today I'm going to be responding to the ContraPoints video pronouns. I'm going to start off with a bit of a preamble about my own thoughts on pronouns, but if you just want to jump straight into the video, then you can skip to that point using the thing below. However, particularly if you're somebody who maybe is coming to this from a perspective of being like pro ContraPoints, and you perhaps maybe even object to the idea that I might be criticizing ContraPoints, it will be worth watching this just so you can actually find out what my views are going into it. I'm not saying it's going to be an exhaustive treatise on pronouns, but it was just the immediate thoughts I had when considering the fact I was going to be making this video. And first of all, I should say that somebody commented a while ago saying that this is the video I should respond to, because I haven't responded to this video before. And they said, oh, you're responding to these ContraPoints videos, but you are failing to actually recognize Contra's sincerely held position, like Contra's essential position, and that is best laid out in the pronouns video. And therefore, I'm hoping that will actually be the case, and we will see. This will be quite a substantial video to respond to. But when you think about it, it makes sense that the main points of view Contra has on gender identity will be expressed in this video on pronouns, because of course pronouns are, in the English language, the primary way that we refer to people's gender identity. And obviously you might argue to what extent people have gender identities, but I'm just using gender identity in a very broad sense to just mean the identification of somebody as either a man or woman. And in that context, of course, we use pronouns. If I want to indicate somebody's a man, chances are overwhelmingly the way I'm going to do that is by just saying he did this, his, him, he, him, his, all that kind of stuff. In fact, I would imagine, for example, that let's say a feminist theorist or something like that, who might spend a lot of time talking about whether or not people are men or women, whether they're discussing violence against women, or they're discussing patriarchy, or they're discussing misogyny, or they're discussing whatever else. Indeed, if they're discussing feminism, whether or not somebody's a man or woman is probably going to be something they refer to quite frequently. But even that will probably pale in comparison to the number of times that they just casually refer to somebody as a man or woman just by using their pronouns. And it does create an interesting question, which is, should that be the case? Because I want to stress that I think it very much should be the case that sometimes we recognize whether somebody is a man or a woman, because when it comes to things like sexual assault, it matters. When it comes to things like patriarchy and sexism, it matters. Of course, when it comes to sexuality, it matters. It matters that I am a straight man who is attracted to women. And if, for example, my female fiance suddenly decided to identify as a man, it matters that, in truth, I don't suddenly therefore become gay. Obviously, I'm still not gay, because even though my fiance might identify as a man, she's still not a man. So it's very obvious to me that whether somebody is a man or woman matters in quite a huge variety of contexts. And therefore, it's worth being able to communicate that somebody's a man or woman. But I can also see the other point of view, which is that whether somebody's a man or woman doesn't matter all the time. And of course, the default third-person singular pronoun is gendered, or rather the two default third-person singular pronouns. If I want to tell you what anybody did, and I want to refer to them, as I would with the third-person singular pronoun, I would say he did this or she did that, and that could be anything they do, including a huge number of things where that they are a man or woman doesn't matter at all. So I am quite sympathetic to this idea that constantly referring to whether or not somebody's a man or woman seems a bit weird. The fact that referring to somebody as a man or woman is baked into our language is a bit strange. I'm also very appreciative of the fact that sometimes, though, we do need to know whether somebody is a man or woman, and knowing and having a reasonable definition for why and how somebody is a man or woman and who is a man or woman matters, and in quite a variety of contexts, especially when talking about sexuality, feminism, and a variety of other things. And I would also stress that if pronouns are going to refer to any demographic distinction at all, it probably should be whether you're a man or woman, because that is the most all-encompassing and significant distinction, demographic distinction, in pretty much all societies that have existed really since kind of the dawn of civilization. Ultimately, race, of course, matters, and people define themselves with reference to race, but it's not this thing that's hugely mattered throughout all human societies. Same thing for kind of age and stuff like that. But gender, whether you're a man or woman, and the roles associated with that, has been a very significant thing throughout all of human history. And indeed, it's a significant thing now. It's a significant thing all over the world. So it makes sense of this massive distinction. And of course, the other thing I didn't mention is it matters when talking about scientific stuff like procreation, things like that. But obviously, the point is, it is the most significant thing. Probably, I would say, second only to economic class. So those were my quick thoughts on pronouns, which I was kind of thinking about when I was, thinking about the fact I was going to be responding to this video today. I kind of thought, what do I think about pronouns? And that's what I kind of thought. So with that said, I'm now going to look at what ContraPoints has to say about pronouns. And we're going to, obviously, perhaps it will in no way intersect with what I said. But I'm just going to be responding to the points as they're made. So I hope you're all ready to enjoy.
The he's become she's, and the she's become he's, and those in the middle are them and them. And then, my dreadful dears, the Western world shall surely succumb to renewable energy, affordable healthcare, and video games for lesbians.
I will notice that this is kind of characterizing the objection to kind of this pronoun nonsense as though it's exclusively coming from the right wing. Let me tell you, as somebody who thinks that, the pronoun nonsense, by which I mean kind of the idea of transgender identities being valid and non-binary identities being valid, as somebody who thinks that's completely ridiculous, I say, yes, please, let's have concerns about environmentalism, let's have workers' rights, let's have lots of other kind of policies that left-wing people would support. As far as I'm concerned, lesbians can have all the video games that they like. So I just wanted to object to that characterization of as if people who are concerned about pronoun nonsense must automatically also be attached to all this other kind of right-wing culture war nonsense. I don't think that's a valid assertion.
Words, words, words. What do they even fucking mean? Well, I don't know, and I don't care. But we have to talk about it anyway, because of a boy named Ben Shapiro.
What do you mean you don't care? You don't care what words mean? Well, you clearly must care a bit, otherwise you would have gone elephant, trombone, spaghetti, hoops. The very fact that you chose to use words to communicate meaning just then speaks to the fact that you must care at least a little bit.
Controversial, politically incorrect, snowflake-smashing refusal to call transgender people by their pronouns.
I'm willing to call Caitlyn Jenner Caitlyn Jenner. I'm not willing to call Caitlyn Jenner a she.
Surprising.
That's pretty much consistent with me, so there we go.
You might think, for a person so insistent on the value of civil discussion.
And let's be civil, right? That's the tone of the day.
Well, there's nothing uncivil about not calling somebody by their pronoun. That's just being consistent. You can ask me to be civil. You can't make a condition of being civil the implicit acceptance of the claim you're making. That's, of course, ridiculous. Again, if an atheist debates a religious person can't insist that civility from the atheist would extend to the atheist tacitly accepting that which the Christian believes. In the same sense, if a pro-trans identity person wants to argue that civility must extend to gender-critical people tacitly accepting the validity of transgender identities, then that's completely ridiculous.
I dislike this trend toward regarding as a conclusive argument the proposition, this makes me feel invalidated, because sometimes things that make you feel bad are true.
Okay, yeah, good. All right, so Contra's doing a good job so far. I mean, well, by that I mean Contra said one correct thing, but that's an improvement.
If I'm delusional, I want to be disillusioned. I don't want people lying to me just to protect whatever deranged fantasy stories I need to tell myself to make it through them.
But what? But you literally went on this whole thing about how not using people's pronouns, or preferred pronouns, I should say, because of course, obviously you clearly don't like people using correct pronouns. But you went on this whole thing about how people not using trans-identified people's preferred pronouns is not civil. But now you're saying, I don't want anyone to indulge me, just give it to me like it is. Give it to me just straight. It seems to me like those two positions are somewhat obviously contradictory, especially considering how much you're trying to stress right now. You're like, well, yeah, if I've got a delusion, just let me know. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. But I get the impression, actually, that if I were as forceful in communicating to you the extent to which I believe you're deluded, as you're implying you would be happy with me being, actually, I would bring upon myself a great deal of wrath. So I don't know what you're on about.
I don't want my gender to be tolerated in the way that liberal Christians tolerate other, of course, false and heathen religions. I am an evangelical transsexual. I don't want toleration, damn it. I want converts. Excuse me, sir. Do you have a moment to talk about my womanhood?
Okay, so basically the point being made there, and by the way, I mean, at this point, it seems like lots of liberal Christians don't even believe other religions are false. But basically the point being made there was like tolerance ain't all that, because tolerance is like people just accept you believing something, but you know they it's not them believing it. So basically Contra is saying, in effect, Contra has no interest in me tolerating the idea of gender identity. As far as Contra is concerned, it's either I believe it or, you know, whatever. Like, me believing it is the only thing that matters. So I guess, yeah, based on that, yeah, it seems like if you are not convinced of the validity of transgender identity, then, at least as far as Contra is concerned, tolerating it isn't really, you know, and I don't want to say it's not an option, but it's not something that should matter. My tolerance for it is irrelevant. And I'm like, okay, you know, that's Contra's opinion. I, you know, would make a point of stressing that I don't think I'm likely to be convinced of the validity of transgender identity, and therefore, apparently, I shouldn't be expected to tolerate it either. So, yeah, thanks, Contra.
Benny, baby, I invite you to disenchant all of my fairy tales, to melt away every crystal of my snowflakery, and henceforth dispense only the most scalding tea. All right, big boy? Let's have it.
I'm willing to call Caitlyn Jenner. I'm not willing to call Caitlyn Jenner a she.
You know what I find funny? Like, there was a whole thing about, like, oh, I'm willing for you to do all of this, blah, 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 blah. But, like, I'm 100% guaranteeing Contra would never debate Ben Shapiro on this topic. Even though Contra being like, I'm ready for you, Ben. Give me all you got. I don't think that Contra would ever debate Ben on this topic. And, you know, like, obviously I could point out I don't think Contra's ever going to debate me, but I'm sure that could be always falling back on the idea of, like, I'm a smaller channel, I don't have the clout, whatever else. Fine. Ben Shapiro is at least at Contra's level, if not significantly above it, and therefore it would seem like a debate between them should be an option. But it strikes me that Contra would not be willing to entertain that debate. And I should mention that I'm recording this just a little bit after Grace Lavery. Like, oh, it was so cringe. Like, after just talking for so long about how not going to back out the debate, not going to back out the debate, and then backs out of the debate. That's what they do. It's what they do. They don't debate. They're scared.
Oh.
Because you can't change your sex. You can change your name.
Right.
Caitlyn Jenner is a man.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's what I think. You can change your name. Like, at the end of the day, if Contra wants to be like, my name is Natalie Wynn, I can't say, no, it's not. And I will also say, by the way, that, you know, I mentioned before how, like, the idea of should we, this was in the preamble, should we, like, make whether you're a man or woman this all-encompassing thing? I think there's a very legitimate case to be made that, like, breaking down the kind of boundaries of what acceptable names there are for men or women to have is a very legitimate thing to, like, you know, challenge. I do think there's kind of an aspect of, like, you probably shouldn't, like, name your kid. Like, it's one of those things where I don't like the idea of, like, progressive parents kind of making their, like, kind of making things harder for their kids by choosing to break down boundaries via their own kids, you know. Like, I personally would not call my son a stereotypical woman's name, nor would I call my daughter a stereotypical man's name, not because I think that the idea that there should be specific men's names and women's names makes sense, but because I don't want to impose on my kid the kind of, you know, I guess, objections that might come from, you know, other children if I were to give them a name like that. But I do think that actually adults making the choice themselves of, hey, I just want to give myself whatever kind of name I like, I'm fine with that. And yeah, I'm totally fine with ContraPoints saying, my name will be Natalie. That's okay. And therefore I'm perfectly happy to call ContraPoints Natalie Wynn. But I'm not happy to call ContraPoints a woman or refer to ContraPoints as she, because that would contradict what I believe is actually possible. So yeah, very much in agreement with Shapiro here.
Biological man, and if he were born with high doses of estrogen in his bloodstream, he would also not be a woman.
Right.
You're determined by your chromosomes.
So the argument is that what it means to be a she is to have a normal female karyotype.
Okay, so this is probably going to be an annoying thing where it's going to be like the nitpicking. I don't want to be so cynical, but it's probably just going to be like, oh, let me just nitpick about chromosomes, ignoring the fact that obviously chromosomes are a very consistently reliable indicator of biological sex, and that these exceptions are really to be dealt with as exceptions, not just to be nitpicked by losers.
So since you think that calling a trans woman she is a lie, and you think that what it means to be a she is to have a normal female karyotype, then you must think that when we call trans woman she, we're saying that she has a normal female karyotype. But hold on, I'm a transgender.
No, that's not true. That's not accurate at all. The point is, I recognize that when you talk about somebody being a woman, you are not referring to that. So that was actually a different argument from what I was expecting, but that's fine. Okay, I recognize that when you use the word woman, when you talk about somebody being a woman, you are not speaking with reference to their chromosomes, and I'm going to say more specifically with reference to their biological sex, or actually not really specifically, more generally with reference to their biological sex. I recognize that. My point is that that's not an appropriate use of the word woman, and that's why it's a lie. I don't think, and of course I very strongly doubt Ben Shapiro thinks, that trans-identified people are referring to biology when they talk about somebody being a man or woman. The whole issue is that they don't think being a woman has anything to do with biology. So this epic own, I think, might be based on a false premise, but let's see.
Woman, and I've never claimed to have a normal female karyotype, and yet my friends, lovers, and most strangers call me she, her, miss, ma'am, girlfriend, ladies. Good girl.
Okay, I'm just going to pause there because I'm getting uncomfortable. I mean, to be fair, like, genuinely, I don't really care about all the strange kind of little theatrics that Contra does. But look, this isn't a cringe channel, right? We all understand that. The only thing we cringe at here are arguments, not that. Anyway, so yeah, basically just really driving home the point of like, well, lots of other people call me a woman and they're not saying this thing. And it's like, yeah, nobody's saying that they're saying that thing. The point is what they're saying, or what I'm saying, is that if they're calling you a woman, that should be what they're saying. You know, it's kind of absurd, actually, when you think about it. It's a bit like, for example, and, you know, it's very fun to do religious analogies. If I said that all Christians have to believe in the Trinity, you can disagree with that as a legitimate definition of Christianity, but let's say that I say that all Christians have to believe in the Trinity. And then, and I say to say anything else is a lie. And then somebody says, oh, so you're saying that if somebody says somebody is a Christian, then they're saying that they believe in the Trinity. But I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. Actually, I think Seventh-day Adventists are a bit murky. So I'll say, but I'm a Jehovah's Witness. And I don't believe in the Trinity. But I call myself a Christian. Actually, you know what? I don't know whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves a Christian. Okay. Scrap it. Unitarian. Okay. We'll just go with Unitarians. I'm a Unitarian. And I don't believe in the Trinity. But I call myself a Christian. Are you saying that I'm calling myself a Trinitarian? Obviously not. Like, I mean, again, that was a long analogy to get to a pretty obvious point. Like, if I define a word a particular way, I'm not suggesting that every single person who uses that word differently and therefore incorrectly is using that word, is trying to use that word the same way I'm using it. The point I'm making is that they're actually willfully using the word radically differently from how I'm using it, which I perceive to be wrong. There's no confusion about the fact that trans-identified people are using the word woman and man in a way that's different from how I'm using it. I'm not thinking that they're trying to use it the way I'm using it and getting it wrong. I think they're wrong because they're not even trying to use it the way I use it.
It is not I who misunderstands biology, Ben Shapiro. It is you who misunderstands language. You have...
Okay, I'm interested in this. So apparently, because I think I laid out a pretty good example of how language, when we talk about definitions, I think I just laid out a pretty good analogy to a different example of language, where when I say that I'm using a word a particular way, it's very legitimate for me to argue that what I mean when somebody's not using that word that way is that they're using that word incorrectly. But apparently, I misunderstand language. So let's see.
Have deceptively framed the debate as a debate about biology, which it is not. We all agree on the biology. The actual subject of the debate...
I don't think Ben Shapiro was framing it as a debate about biology. I think Ben Shapiro was saying that he thinks that that's what women should be describing, the same way I think that's what women should be describing. But we recognize that the debate is about what should women be describing. I recognize that that's a debate that matters. While, of course, I've literally, again, I'm not Ben Shapiro, so I realize ContraPoints isn't arguing against me. But let's just say I can be the Ben Shapiro substitute for a little while. Like I very frequently said, for example, I don't really care about the biological debate. Like when I'm called upon to really get to the nitty gritty of differences of sexual development and all that kind of stuff, I fall apart and go, I don't really know. I'm not a biology guy. I'm sorry. But what I am is a guy who has a kind of very significant interest and I think a lot of knowledge on this question of how does it make sense to understand and define the words man and woman. That's the debate I'm interested in. So the fact that this is a language debate suits me right down to a T.
But how do we decide on the correct way to use a word?
That's a good question. Okay. Two kinds of grammar: descriptive and prescriptive.
Well, there are two kinds of arguments we could make, descriptive or prescriptive. If we take the descriptive approach, then what we must do is act like anthropologists and study the way a word, for instance, she, is used by a linguistic community, and whatever the social convention is what's correct. But if we take the prescriptive approach, then we must make an argument about the way the word she should be used, meaning we either defer to an authority, such as the dictionary, or my ruler on your wrist, you naughty boy, or we must have some goal that we want to accomplish by
Yeah, okay, so that's an accurate description of linguistics. There is prescriptive linguistics and descriptive linguistics. I would argue that a lot of the time a synthesis is important. One of the things which I think is always worth stressing, and I kind of talk about this with reference to philosophy, and I believe it was John Rawls who defined philosophy as the attempt to establish a framework to coherently explain human intuition. And I think similarly, one of the purposes of linguistics should be to establish a framework to coherently account for the use of language. And the reality is that sometimes people use language in ways that are incoherent. And in that context, I would argue we can use a descriptive understanding of how language is being used while also using a prescriptive understanding to recognize where that language should be being used more consistently. And that's my take. I recognize that just outright asserting, well, language has to be used this way, is of course absurd. But at the same time, saying that, well, this is how language is used in this particular context, and therefore we can't make any judgments at all about whether or not this is a sensible way to be using this word, I think is equally flawed and nonsensical. I think a synthesis is the best approach. So that's my personal opinion, just to quickly address the idea of prescriptivism versus descriptivism.
Now, if we take the descriptive approach, you lose, Ben Shapiro, because most people call me she, and that's all there is to it.
Again, see, this is an interesting thing because, again, the point I would make is, but why are they calling you she? And I also think, by the way, and this is a key point to bear in mind, that there is not just, and again, I feel like descriptivism is not going to be explored to its full extent. I mean, based on the fact that Contra literally just said, if we do descriptivism, you lose. Well, sure, if you do like very literal, just strict descriptivism, but then, for example, you run into issues of like morality. For example, people used to use lots of very offensive words to refer to particular groups of people. You would accurately describe that's a word people used. But does that mean that you can't therefore make prescriptive claims about how that word should be used? I would argue that you can still make prescriptive claims about how words should be used because words might be used in a way which is immoral. And for example, to drive this home, I would argue that the reason why people might refer to ContraPoints as a woman is because people have very sexist ideas, very stereotypical ideas about what a woman should look like. So they look at ContraPoints, recognize ContraPoints is embodying stereotypical femininity, and therefore call ContraPoints a woman. I can understand that. I think the descriptivist in me is recognizing that's what's happening. Here's the big issue, though. The prescriptivist thinks, well, is that an appropriate way to define the word woman? Actually, no, that's quite a grossly offensive way to understand the word woman, to understand woman with reference to these traditionalist and often kind of hypersexualized stereotypes. That's a very legitimate line of inquiry. So I do agree that, sure, if you just got this pure, boring descriptivism that's just like, well, this is how the word's used, so that's it, then sure, technically I would lose, of course. But yeah, I think that it's that kind of descriptivism is rubbish anyway. So, like, I'm perfectly happy to lose, in keeping with that sort of just boring descriptivism.
What's more, your usage of a she and a he is ungrammatical. You don't put an article before a pronoun. That's not how pronouns work, you silly dum-dum. Also, human sex...
I don't know if that was supposed to be a joke, where, like, because that was prescriptivism, right? You're saying, well, this isn't grammatically correct. But if on descriptivism, nothing's grammatically incorrect. So, yeah, I'm not really sure about that.
Chromosomes were discovered in 1905, while the English pronouns he and she originate in the Proto-Germanic language spoken during the pre-Roman Iron Age of Northern Europe beginning around 500 BCE. Therefore...
Okay, so I feel like maybe this is trying to be like a hyper nitpicky joke, but I just need to point out the obvious. You can be describing something before you're able to scientifically explain what it is you're describing. For example, people could talk about air before they were able to correctly describe the scientific composition of air. You know, people could observe the different planets in the sky before they were able to kind of understand all the scientific complexities to it. People were able to identify different species before they could explain what exactly made things different species. We can observe differences before we can fully explain those differences. And indeed, we can quite easily observe that there are biological males and biological females before we can really explain what it is that makes somebody biologically male and biologically female. One is not so easily done as the other.
By insisting that the singular third-person pronouns of the English language refer specifically to karyotype, it is you, and not I, who is breaking from linguistic tradition, Ben Shapiro.
Okay, so there's the claim. You're breaking from linguistic tradition, which, I mean, is arguably true. I don't think, again, like, society's been sexist for a long time. I'm kind of convinced that you could make a credible argument that actually, yes, somebody who is presenting as stereotypically female or stereotypically feminine might, in many traditional cultures, be able to convince people to refer to themselves as, or rather to refer to this individual as a woman. Because, of course, societies were traditional and sexist and gross and all that kind of stuff. That's why I obviously think that prescriptivism, the critique of how language is used historically, is a very valid approach. Now, I would, however, point out that this begs the question, how exactly is Contra understanding what it means to be a man or woman? You'll notice that so far, Contra has engaged in a very atomized approach to this discussion, focusing entirely on Contra's identification as a woman. But that's not enough, is it? Because we would need to understand, well, okay, sure, Contra might identify as a woman, but why is it that Contra's identity as a woman is valid? And is anybody else's identity as a woman valid? And we would have to ask an obvious question, or address an obvious reality. Contra is referred to as a woman, but if Ben Shapiro identified as a woman, he probably wouldn't be described as a woman, just based on his identity. He would have to in some way embody stereotypical femininity. Just identifying as a woman would not be enough to get him referred to as a woman by lots of people. And that creates a very obvious question, which is, so are we therefore saying that what makes somebody a woman is adherence to stereotypical femininity? These are very important questions that Contra is pretty obviously glossing over. And, obviously I'm not discounting the possibility it will be mentioned later, but that's a very key point to bear in mind. We'll continue.
However, as a trans woman, it's not generally in my interest to defer to traditions. So let's try out a prescriptive approach.
I do like that. Not generally in my interest to defer to traditions. Meanwhile, you're very clearly embodying a stereotypical idea of femininity. It's not me. I don't want to refer to traditions. That's why I claim to be a woman and also wear makeup and wear my hair long. Good one. Yeah, clearly you hate tradition.
Without simply appealing to the way a word is already used, how do we decide how a word should be used?
Okay, yeah, good. I'm excited. I mean, I kind of assumed based on how much of the video was left and how quickly the descriptivism thing was dismissed, we were going to get into this. I'm excited to see this. I'm actually, genuinely, actually, the person who said, this is the video by Contra you should be responding to, they're right. This is genuinely a video which I am thoroughly enjoying. And I am actually finding it very interesting. I've noticed a few holes in like arguments and stuff being missed out. But yeah, I'm still excited.
Ben Shapiro thinks we should not call trans women she because his political goal is to reinforce rigid conservative gender roles, whereas I think we should call trans women she because my political goal is to live in a society where I can achieve the same level of sadness and dysfunction as everyone else.
Okay, so that was a weird sentence. I mean, ultimately, I would imagine actually Ben Shapiro's main goal is to just have the word woman be used coherently in a way that makes sense. It's not about, and the issue we'd have to explain there is why is it that, for example, people like me and also many radical feminists completely disagree with Ben Shapiro on traditional gender roles, but agree with him on gender identity. Again, I know you like to pretend that that radical feminists do support traditional gender roles because, you know, these people are... Look, even Judith Butler, I think, said that radical feminists support traditional gender roles. And I don't want to say, like, even Judith Butler as if, like, Judith Butler is respectable, but Judith Butler is respected by gender identity extremists. So, ultimately, your claim that Ben Shapiro's opinion on the validity of transgender identity must be motivated by some view towards the idea that traditional gender roles are good and should be upheld is blatantly contradicted by the huge number of people who absolutely oppose traditional gender roles, but completely agree with Ben Shapiro on gender identity. So that's just a mischaracterization.
It's analogous to the debate about same-sex marriage from a decade ago. Opponents argue
It's not analogous, of course. It's nothing like analogous. Same-sex marriage ultimately was quite clearly underpinned by an aversion to the idea that that I know what the point's going to be. Okay, so I'll maybe respond to the point as it's made. But I would just say right now that my take is that the same-sex marriage debate was entirely defined by this idea that some people thought that same-sex relationships were morally inferior to other relationships. Whereas, of course, in this case, there is nothing which is viewed as morally inferior because there isn't really a material reality to cast moral judgment on when we're talking about transgender identity. It's an entirely non-materialist thing. But yeah, I'll let Contra make the point.
the dictionary and legal definition of marriage was union between a man and a woman, and the definition shouldn't be changed because it's the definition.
Okay, so there we go. That's the claim there. Well, this is equivalent. And sure, I mean, it's equivalent in that, yes, it was about people arguing over whether a definition should be changed. But you will also notice, and this is a very key point, that attached to marriage are a significant variety of like benefits and like actual things which change the material reality of a relationship. You will also notice, and this is a key thing, that attached to marriage, there is this idea of a certain kind of moral judgment. Marriage is traditionally a sacrament, which, aka, if you can work out the derivation, means sacred. And while obviously sacred has a very specific religious connotation, it more generally just refers to something as like nice and good. It's sacred. It's, you know, it's a positive thing. And marriage, I think, has historically and traditionally been understood as in some ways an affirmation of a relationship. That obviously two people can be just in a casual relationship, and that's one thing. But getting married, taking it to the next level, is a very significant thing within our society. So there is a pretty obvious kind of moral dimension to the label of a relationship being a marriage. And I think that is what many same-sex couples wanted. They wanted that affirmation, that moral affirmation that comes with the label of marriage. Now, here's the issue. Is there a moral affirmation which comes with being referred to as a woman or a man? I would argue that there either isn't, or at least that there shouldn't be, because of course being a man or woman should not describe some kind of moral character. That's a deeply sexist, gender essentialist thing to believe. Rather, being a man or woman should only describe the materiality of being biologically male or biologically female. Now, you might say, if you wanted to, that marriage also shouldn't have any kind of moral dimension to it. I personally think that monogamy is pretty epic, but I mean, obviously I'm a Christian, but basically, either way, actually, there are, for example, same-sex couples who actually don't want to, who don't think the idea of like that marriage is this special sacred thing it should be taken particularly seriously. And those are the many same-sex attracted couples who aren't interested in the idea of same-sex couples being able to get married because they think that's a kind of heteropatriarchal thing. So the point is that you can debate that, and people do debate that, but ultimately they're separate debates. And the point is that it's very legitimate for somebody who does think of marriage as a sacrament, as sacred, as validating, as something which is a moral affirmation of a relationship being in some way better than and superior to other relationships, to want same-sex relationships to be just as able to engage with that sacrament of marriage as other relationships, as heterosexual relationships. That's very legitimate. But conversely, somebody making that exact same logic but for the label woman is necessarily engaging in gender essentialist and deeply sexist nonsense.
And how am I supposed to explain to my child? And on the other hand, gay people argue that the definition should be changed.
Okay, I actually want to point something out right there. So how am I supposed to explain to my child? You'll notice, though, that explaining to a child that two men have got married is incredibly easy. Like, that's kind of the funny thing, you know? Like, very obviously, like, the whole, like, oh, being gay is hard to explain. It literally makes no sense at all. Like, I genuinely have no idea how some people are so brain dead that they can't explain the simple concept of a gay relationship. It's like, hey, you know how men can be, like, in love with women? Well, imagine if the man in that situation was a woman, or the woman in that situation was a man. Imagine, you know, like, literally, you could explain this to a bloody 5-year-old, right? It's so bloody easy. You know, imagine if when Snow White and the prince met each other, what if Snow White was a man, but the prince still loved Snow White and kissed Snow White, and Snow White got up, and then they decided they loved each other so much that they decided to get married. There's no issue there. Like, basically, it's pretty obvious that a relationship remains kind of, in many ways, unchanged. I mean, I don't want to say, like, the fact that two people are both men has nothing to do with it. But lots of aspects of a relationship, the meeting each other, talking to each other, getting to know each other, liking each other, going on dates with each other, kissing each other, maybe you wouldn't explain this to a kid, but having sex with each other, and then the eventual deciding you want to spend the rest of your life with each other and getting married. These things are not that substantively, obviously sex maybe being the big exception, but again, you don't have to explain that to kids is the good news, or at least not until they're a kind of appropriate age. So literally everything apart from the sex is not substantively affected at all by whether or not these people are men or women. So explaining gay marriage to your kids should be really easy, but I need to bring it up or explain how easy it is, because here's the flip side. How do you explain transgender identity to your kids? Right? Like, I couldn't explain transgender identity to a kid. I could do a deeply sexist explanation of something which trans identity advocates claim is not what trans identity is. I could say, well, some men feel like women, and therefore they are women. I could say that to my kid, but that would be nonsense. And then my kid would, you know, the issue is, okay, so I could say that to my kid, but then what if my kid said, well, what does it mean to feel like a woman? Then I would, you know, at that point I'd be like, well, you know, they just like a woman feels, that's how they feel. It's like, but surely a woman feels like a woman because she's a woman. How does a man feel? Like, it's a very legitimate thing to argue, like, well, what does it mean to say somebody feels like a woman? Let me tell you this, okay? Never mind explaining it to your kids. Explain it to me, please. I don't really understand this idea of transgender identity. I've heard people talk about it for a long time, but I still don't fully understand exactly what it is people are talking about when they say, I live as a woman, or whatever else kind of nonsense. So yeah, the funny thing is that Contra has actually, like, shown just how ridiculous trans identity here is by mentioning, how do I explain to my kids? Because it's like, look, explain to kids the idea of two men getting married is super easy. Like, super easy. Basically, imagine two people getting married, then imagine they're both men. Explaining trans identity to a kid, again, I can only stress the point, explain it to me. I don't think it's not a coherent concept, so yeah, I just thought that was a fun point to stress.
Because they wanted to achieve the same level of sadness and dysfunction as everyone else. And they succeeded, because as it turns out,
I like the whole like, huh, isn't marriage terrible? It's like it's such like a lame joke. Like I mean, I remember I saw it on Family Guy one time where Peter's like, "Hey, if gays want to get married and be miserable like the rest of us, I say let them." And like, I'm not offended by it or anything, but it's just like it's such like an old lame joke at this point. Just, marriage bad. Gay people want to do the marriage even though it's bad, and it's like, okay, good joke. I don't know. It's just a lame joke that I've just seen repeated so many times, and Contra's even repeated that same joke like twice in this video already. Anyway.
Out, you can in fact change the definitions of words. The dictionary is simply a usage guide, it's not the Bible, and for that matter, you can change the Bible.
I mean, you can change the Bible, that is true. But yeah, because like, you know, it's a translation, you can change the translation. But yeah, basically, I just wanted to quickly say that you'll notice this isn't actually a criticism of prescriptivism, because prescriptivism is assuming you can change the definition of words, right? So like Contra's saying this as if it's some kind of substantial point, but nobody's saying you can't change the definition of words. The point is that doesn't therefore open the floor to any word changing meaning. I made this joke when I was talking about crit facts, like I can't just start eating meat, claim I'm a vegan, and then say, well, words can change meanings. Are you denying that words can change meanings? There is a massive gap between, like a huge gulf between words can change meanings, which, by the way, I should point out is it has nothing to do with either descriptivism or prescriptivism. It's just irrelevant. Like, words can change meaning because you're describing them as changing meaning, or they can change meaning because you're prescribing that they change meaning or saying they should change meaning. But there's a massive gulf between that and saying that any given particular word should just be taken as having changed meaning.
I mean, have you read the contemporary English version? The prose is atrocious, appalling. I won't stand for this, but
ContraPoints is canonically KJVO.
It seems to me that whatever church, state, and Merriam-Webster decide, trans women already are and will continue to be women. And to see why, I want to elaborate on an argument posed to Ben Shapiro by my sometime rival Blair White.
Okay, so that was quite the assertion there, basically, that no matter what the dictionary says, no matter what church authority says, no matter what anybody says, trans-identified males are women. Get over it, sunshine, snowflake, or whatever.
Blair responds by observing that Ben's way of using pronouns is in her case completely impractical.
Well, if you and I were to go to a business dinner or any kind of dinner and you were meeting me at a restaurant and I was there first and I was in an orange shirt and you had to tell, the host, I'm here to meet my friend Blair, and they said, okay, and you had to describe me to take me to the table, you wouldn't say the man in the orange shirt, you would say Blair, you would say her over there.
Ben then
Okay, so the claim there, before we get into Ben Shapiro's response, the claim there is, well, there is a social utility to identifying somebody who looks stereotypically like a woman as a woman. Now, what you will immediately notice is, again, we're still stuck in this reality that specifically how we can consider ContraPoints or Blair White to be women needs to be applicable to society in general, or like we need to be able to extrapolate that more generally to say what is it we're actually describing when we're saying these people are women. And in this case, you seem to have a more, like a very direct admission. I mean, it was already kind of implied. Well, it's about them looking stereotypically like women, which creates a few. Yeah, so there's a few issues here. The first issue, and most obvious issue, is that somebody can look stereotypically like a woman and yet not identify as a woman, in which case it might be socially useful to describe them as a woman, but it would be absurd to claim that they therefore are a woman because they don't even claim to be a woman. For example, it may be that if I was, totally like, let's say got the ContraPoints makeover, that I might look more like a woman than I did like a man. And it might be the most socially useful thing in terms of immediately identifying me would be to say, that woman over there. But I would not be claiming to be a woman. I would not identify as a woman. Nor would nor would anyone else, but nor would lots of other people identify me as a woman. So you would find yourself in the illogical conclusion that despite the fact that I don't claim to be a woman, I am in fact a woman because it is more useful, more expedient in a social situation to refer to me as a woman, which is absurd. You also have the counter to that, the innumerable examples of people who claim to be women, but would probably not be most immediately referred to as a woman. And of course, I think actually a very obvious example of this would be the huge number of trans-identified females who just look like women. You know, there's lots of women with short hair who claim to be trans men. It would actually be, I think, often lots quicker for me to say that woman over there with the short hair than that man over there. That man over there who just happens to look a lot like a woman. So you can see how either way it doesn't work. You have people who might look like women, such that it will be quicker and more expedient to say that woman over there, but they might not identify as a woman. And then you have the flip side, which is people who might identify as either a man or woman, but don't look that much like how they identify in kind of a stereotypical sense. So it would not be remotely expedient to say that man over there when you're pointing at somebody who's obviously a biological female. So this doesn't work. And of course, all of that is ignoring the absurd conclusion that it is the social utility and expediency of how you refer to somebody that should define what they are. That's also a pretty absurd conclusion. I don't think I can really entertain it. But we're going to see what Ben Shapiro's response is and see whether or not Ben Shapiro gives a good response or a bad response.
Response saying,
I think there's some truth to that, meaning that I think that there is a utility to the use of pronouns, but that's not quite the same as suggesting that a transgender woman is a she in the objective sense.
Oh my God, he's so right. Oh no, I agree with Ben Shapiro. Oh no, I must... I must truly be the Daily Wire contributor that I never truly thought I was. Basically, Ben Shapiro, he didn't communicate it as kind of verbosely as I did, but he essentially got at the exact same point. And he even used the exact same word, utility. So, yeah, Ben Shapiro and I clearly agree, which was, it's kind of fantastic, just how much it was kind of like, I obviously set it up with kind of like a quite elaborate explanation of why that's true, and then Ben just quite snappily made the point.
For instance, if someone were to adopt children, there's no biological basis for calling them that kid's parents, because they're not. Like, they're just literally not. There's no link at all biologically, but there is a social reason to do it, and there's a legal reason to do it.
let's expand on that analogy.
Okay, so I just want to touch on that really briefly. So the point there was basically... if somebody's adoptive parents, then they're not the kid's biological parents, but you can still refer to them as parents of a sort. And you'll notice, like, one of the main issues here is it's different things. But I suppose, obviously I'll try and make it as analogous as possible. The issue is that actually, when we talk about somebody being a parent, you are talking about a material reality. You're talking about a certain role that they assume. The question then becomes, are you suggesting that women are defined with reference to certain roles they assume? And if so, is that not deeply sexist? The reality is that yes, the reason I would be happy to call somebody's adoptive parents their parents is because they are fulfilling the role of parents. They are doing what parents should do. There are obligations that come with being a parent. They are fulfilling those obligations. There is a huge, vast material reality to what it means to be somebody's parent. So the question becomes, are people who affirm transgender identity going to be so brazenly sexist as to say that all of this also applies to being a woman, that there are roles that women should do, there are expectations of what women should do, these are things that women need to fulfill, and when women fulfill those roles, we can call them women? You can see kind of the issue there, can't you? You can see how that's actually incredibly gender essentialist, incredibly sexist to assert. The reality is that somebody's adoptive parent is somebody's parent. A biological male wearing a dress is just a biological male wearing a dress, even if they are in some way, fitting with some societal expectations of what it means to be a woman. That does not mean they have in fact become a woman. Anyway, I'll look at ContraPoints expanding on the analogy.
You did not beget or bring forth offspring, they argue. Therefore, you are not a parent. Facts don't care about your feelings. No matter how much you love and care for this child, you'll never be anything but a glorified kidnapper.
Again, you'll notice that it's talking about your interpersonal relationship to another person, as if that's what validates that is what validates your identity as a parent in the case of being an adoptive parent. But it does not validate your identity as a woman, and to assert that it does would be, again, quite deeply sexist. The reality is that somebody being a woman is something that extends from who they are. It's not something that extends from their interaction with other people. And again, you would have to be therefore asserting there is a particular womanly way to interact with other people, which would be sexist.
But they're not just impolite, they're also wrong.
Okay, so I think we're going to end there. Basically, ultimately, I think I will agree that that person in that specific situation who says that you aren't somebody's parent if you're merely their adoptive parent is wrong. The issue is that being somebody's parent is not the same thing as being a woman. Adopting somebody is not the same thing as being transgender. Obviously, I don't want to say because it's not the same, therefore there's no valid analogy. Of course, analogy is necessarily about things that aren't the same, but I would argue that these two things are not sufficiently analogous for the analogy to hold. What ContraPoints would really need to do here to make this more interesting is to give an argument, and maybe Contra will do this. I'm stopping now because I think we've got a third of the way through the video, so I'm going to stop here. But yeah, maybe ContraPoints will do this, but what Contra needs to do is present an argument for why it makes sense to understand somebody's adoptive parents as their parents, and then make an argument for why it makes sense to say that somebody who is, or at least show how that argument could similarly be applied to why we might understand a biological male as a woman. The issue is ContraPoints isn't really explaining why it makes sense to understand a adoptive parent as a parent, and what ContraPoints has said so far has basically just been the role you perform, the feelings you have towards another person. And again, if we say that that is analogous to how we might understand a biological male as a woman, we're arriving at some deeply problematic territory, and I can't endorse that. I can say that somebody's adoptive parents are their parents, and I can accept the reason that one of the reasons that would be the case is because of the role they fulfill. I can't then turn around and be like, oh, in that case, it makes complete sense to me why we might say a biological male is a woman, because I don't believe there is a role women fulfill. I am not that type of sexist. Maybe Contra is. Maybe Blair White is. Anyway, but I do want to stress, okay, this video has genuinely been really interesting. This is possibly my favorite video I've responded to because it's actually touching on the thing which I find most interesting, which is, of course, why does it make sense to say a biological male can be a woman? I don't think it's done a great job. I'm not sure if it will do a better job in the remaining 2/3 of the video, but I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how things pan out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you had some fun. I hope to see you again sometime, perhaps for part 2. Well, I'm not quite sure when part 2 will be out, but I'll record it relatively quickly. But I like to fiddle around when I release things. I got my little schedule. Anyway, I'm very appreciative of you having watched. I would be even more appreciative if you liked, if you smashed that like button, if you shared, if you commented, if you subscribed, all the algorithm things, you can do that. Twitter, it's great. Followers, all that kind of stuff. Cross-platform things. Gilded. It's a place where people discuss my videos, and kind of it's a bit more, it's not like the YouTube comments, or it's more like kind of just back and forth kind of stuff. And of course, there is Patreon. Now, if you give on Patreon, I will say thank you very much. That's really appreciated. And I will do it in the form of the end credits of my video. And I think that sounds like a pretty sweet deal for me, to me. So I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, Charlotte, Sambuca, and Skeptical. You're all very appreciated.